All right. Hey, everyone. This is the SIG Auth meeting for April 15th, 2020. Let's get started. So we have a pretty full agenda. I wanted to note a cap I had written. I do not expect people to have read it yet or anything like that. I just wanted to bring it up and let people have a chance to look at it. We have a full agenda, so I don't want to discuss this. I want to give time to everyone else who has been in the agenda far earlier than me. So Jim, did you want to share your screen or anything like that, or did you just want to talk?
Yeah, I can share my screen. I prepared a few slides to help the discussion.
Awesome, thank you. Let me now figure out how to let you share screen in Zoom. Let's see, I think.
It says host disable participant screen sharing. Yeah, there we go. Maybe. No?
Now, does anybody know how to do this? I can allow you to record, which does not seem like what we want.
Okay. Yeah, maybe if you want to just present the slides, right? The links in the doc, I can just quickly walk through them.
Okay. You guys see these? Jim, did you want to go ahead? Are you able to see?
Yeah, this is, I think we can work with this. Okay, so I think it was about 2 meetings ago, we briefly discussed, I'd introduced this topic. It's a project that we're working on in the multi-tenancy working group. So what we want to do with this initiative, with this multi-tenancy benchmarks effort, the intent was to try and address the question that we were getting from a lot of users, which was, how do I know if my cluster is properly set up for multi-tenancy? And one way of doing that is, of course, you could specify what needs to be configured, or you point to some tool or some way of defining multi-tenancy itself. But the other approach that we wanted to kind of explore was, what if we can just validate or test for multi-tenancy without being opinionated or too opinionated about how exactly that's set up, and then provide some test suite which users can run on their cluster, which would let them know if multi-tenancy is correctly configured or not. So that's the high-level intent of the multi-tenancy benchmarks initiative. And really what we wanted to do, or what I wanted to collect in this session, is just get feedback on the concepts, on the approach, and then I'll talk about where we are with the project and just to get thoughts on next steps.
So Jim, if I understood that correctly, you guys like deploy some workloads and have them do something on the cluster, and whatever feedback they get from those executions, they.
Exactly. So we took the conformance tests as one of the sort of using the E2E test package as one of the types of tests that could be run as a cluster. And that was like something we looked at as a model. We also looked at other tools which do things like for CIS benchmarks. There's a few tools out there like Kubebench and others which can run for configuration checks. So looking at some of those tools, the intent is to allow administrators or cluster operators to define some inputs in a definition like a YAML definition. Then this would automatically, the test suite would run and report back whether multi-tenancy is correctly configured. Now, the assumption here, obviously, we're building on namespaces as a basic construct, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, is to check for various levels of things, some of it which could be configuration checks, some could be behavioral and runtime checks.
So I'm curious, all right, like, does it like work today? Like, if I wanted to like maybe check like an Amazon cluster or a Azure cluster or GCP cluster, like, does it, or an OpenShift cluster, do I get like some feedback?
Yeah, so we have a few of the tests automated, and that's something that we're working on, doing more of those. But the intent would be with any what you would require for configuration checks, of course, that depending on whether if the cluster, the control plane is available or not, could vary. But for the behavioral checks, yes, it would create, the test suite would create namespaces, would try different configurations, would try and do things across different namespaces. Just even, for example, checking for network isolation, but without, being too prescriptive about how exactly network isolation in that example should be set up, right? So there are a few test cases we've automated just as a proof of concept, but the intent was before we go off and do too many more, just at least gather feedback on the various profile levels, the test categories, and the way we were starting to define these tests. Okay, so just some high-level concepts, and this is not, necessarily tied to this initiative, but just in the working group itself, of course, you have to start with some definition of what a tenant is, and this is where the intent is to stay fairly flexible. So for the scope of these benchmarks, these tests, a tenant really is just either a user or a group of users that owns some set of namespaces which are isolated from other tenant namespaces. And there were three roles that we were interested in. One is, of course, is a cluster operator, cluster admin role. There's a tenant admin role where the assumption being that that tenant can manage their own set of namespaces and and configure different aspects of multi-tenancy for those namespaces. And then there's users within these tenant namespaces who may not be able to do things like add additional users, etc., within the tenant namespace, but they can run workloads, manage workloads in those namespaces. So, and the other thing we started looking at is how do we, categorize and define these benchmarks, right? So we took like the CIS benchmarks were, of course, sort of a guideline and inspiration, and they defined the various profile levels. So similarly, what we were thinking of is how do we allow for a fairly broad and flexible range of cluster configurations, like anything from, if you're bringing up a cluster directly through using Kubernetes or any other tool like that, and you want to manually set up some multi-tenancy and configure namespaces, how do you make sure that's done correctly? Worse, and moving more towards automated ways of setting up clusters, managing multi-tenancy, and various solutions like OpenShift or various cloud providers or other systems would then have their own ways of defining projects or whatever they call their multi-tenancy concepts within those solutions. So, but the idea would be to be able to run the tests across these and to see what profile level that setup meets. And to do this, we also looked at, there's about 7 different categories that were identified in terms of what to cover. And then the test types, like we were discussing before, would be either configuration checks, or behavioral checks, right? And as much as possible, we wanted to make this behavioral, but in a few areas, it seemed like we would need to either rely on other benchmarks or other tests, like if CIS benchmarks have a profile level for configuration checks, that could be one way of doing it, or we would need to run some configuration checks ourselves. And then just to kind of cover the profile levels, and then we'll stop and maybe have some discussion, because I think for the scope of this meeting and the time we have, that would be good to in terms of a milestone. But so the first profile level we're thinking about is a fairly manual configuration where the idea is, what would be checked for is to make sure that tenants can't impact the Kubernetes control plane. And with this setup, it would be using standard Kubernetes resources. So it should not be necessary to run like any additional controllers or CRs or things like that to enable multi-tenancy. And it would be restricted, so features like, for example, tenants would not be able to have their own CRD definitions, and some features may not work in this setup, right? But the idea was, even with namespace configuration, how do you make sure that namespaces are properly isolated across tenants? And that should be something we can audit and check for. The next level up would be to allow, would extend on the first level, but then would also allow self-service. So the idea there with level 2 would be to say tenants would not be restricted necessarily to a single namespace, but should be allowed to create their own namespaces. And there should be the ability to do some self-service management of other resources within those namespace, like network policies. So say, for example, there could be a default network policy that the cluster admin sets up, but then tenant admins should be able to add their own network policies for their workloads, and even define like roles and role bindings for their namespaces. So this is where projects like the next topic on the agenda, Ryan and Adrian are going to present HNC. The intent was that HNC would be a good example of this level 2 automation where it would show some of that self-service tenants could do.
I guess I have a general question on this. Like other than namespaces, I'm not really aware of any like built-in boundaries within Kubernetes. Certainly you can have extra boundaries. Like OpenShift has projects and there's self-service approaches to that. I'm sure that you can do some kind of self-service flow through like the cloud provider APIs, but that seems like incredibly specific to any given like variation of Kubernetes, right? So are you like trying to build in like some abstraction layer where you're like, I want to like do something, so I'll know what cluster I use, so then it can do that. Because I'm not sure necessarily how you do this in a way that's sort of.
Yeah. So the intent was to start with just seeing if tenants can create namespaces, and perhaps there's controllers and others which are running in the background, which then augment that namespace for multi-tenancy or the right configurations as required. Now, what we're seeing, and in reality, that becomes a bit tricky, and the user experience there is not that great if you're using just role bindings to allow or deny various operations on namespaces. So most of the projects that are doing this type of tenant namespace management, they do have some CR, and within the multi-tenancy working group, there is also a tenant controller which will then take over the management of these namespaces. So what we haven't figured out yet, and I don't know like the full spectrum of these type of solutions, but the idea would be that one level is, okay, can I just create namespaces, and then do they get set up correctly? The other level would be if there's a custom resource, which in turn acts as a proxy for creating the namespace. We create that custom resource, and these would be configurations the user would supply based on whichever type of cluster that they're auditing. And based on that custom resource, then namespaces would get created on behalf of the tenant, and then we would validate the namespaces at that level.
So yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead. I'll add just one more comment here from the multi-tenancy working group perspective, which is that to the question, yes, we are not introducing new concepts beyond namespaces, but the way to look at it is that the baseline multi-tenancy is with one namespace equals one tenant. The second level is sort of an aggregation of namespaces equals a tenant. An aggregation could either be a hierarchy, like the HNC work is working on, or it could be simply an aggregation of workspaces that namespaces that are managed by a single tenant controller, but they need not have a hierarchy. It's a flat list of namespaces that happen to be under one tenant. And then the third level is a virtual cluster where there's essentially a virtual API server for each tenant. So that's sort of the way we have been thinking, that the working group has been thinking, but we definitely welcome any feedback and guidance. And then the benchmarks is sort of in an orthogonal direction to sort of independent of, in some sense, mapping to the profiles that Jim was talking about, which is, having benchmarks for each level of the three levels I mentioned earlier, which is one namespace equals one tenant, or an aggregation of namespaces equals one tenant, or a virtual cluster with a virtual API server equals one tenant. But this is definitely a work in progress, and we welcome all feedback. Sorry, Jim. Hopefully that.
No, thank you.
No, that's fine. I wanted to ask if this is a good time to transition to get some understanding of the hierarchical namespaces that Ryan, you have a check for, and then maybe that will sort of help us in this discussion.
Sure. Jim, were you all done?
Yeah, pretty much. I think that introduced the main concepts, and certainly in the slides there's links to the Git repo as well as there's a working document. So please do add in comments, even if something comes up later or any thoughts. Feel free to reach out. But with that, I think it's a good time to transition, and let's cover HNC.
Cool. So hi, I'm Ryan from Cray, and I have with me Adrian from Google. Adrian is the lead developer of hierarchical namespaces, and I've just been kind of helping out. And it's kind of all started we are part of the multi-tenancy working group, and we've been developing this hierarchical namespace controller for a little while now. We're nearing an MVP, and we were trying to find a permanent home. And as we tried to go down that path, we found that we were very out of scope with what we had. Working groups are not supposed to own code, as we found out. And so requesting a repo cannot happen until we actually become a subproject of a SIG. And since SIG Auth is our sponsor, that's why we're here. So that's kind of the backstory. We're really just looking for a permanent home, wherever that may be, for the hierarchical namespace controller. At a high level, the hierarchical namespace controller is just that. It allows you to have some sort of hierarchy of namespaces and will propagate resources, both Kubernetes and custom resources, into the children namespace. And Adrian can speak to it much better than I can if you want to add anything.
I'll just add,
go ahead.
I'll just add one thing very quickly. From the name, it might sound like this might belong under like SIG API machinery or something like that. But this is not an API machinery change. These are the hierarchical namespaces that we create are completely normal Kubernetes namespaces, just with some additional labels and annotations that we put on them and some additional controls. One of those controls is that you can, in one namespace, you can create a little CRD that we've defined called a hierarchical namespace object. And when you create that, it causes another namespace to be created underneath you. And then the other thing it does is that it copies objects from parent namespaces to children or from ancestors to descendants, the most important of which are RBAC roles and role bindings, which means that if you have a certain amount of access in a parent namespace, you will also get it in all of its descendants, unless you were granted that through a cluster role binding, but we'll ignore that for a second. So we've been developing this. We've gotten some good feedback on it. It's just now getting to the point where it's usable without any artificial limitations, such as the types of resources that it can copy. It can also do secrets, config maps, stuff like that. And as of recently, other CRDs. And so having it in an incubator directory in a temporary repo owned by a group that isn't supposed to own code didn't seem ideal anymore. So that's why we're looking for the best place to put it. Any other clarity that I can provide about the agency right now? Just before we move on. Oh, hearing none. Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
I
Mike.
think Mike is unmuted, so. Mike, are you trying to talk? Or not? Okay. Any feedback? David, Jordan, Tim?
I only just now saw this because I did not look at the agenda beforehand, so I haven't had a chance to really digest what's here.
So if I recall correctly, I think it was KubeCon San Diego. Did we have a discussion around this, Adrian? I'm trying to remember. It's all like real fuzzy.
Not in the context of SIG Auth, no. The multi-tenancy working group had several sessions, and I talked about this at those sessions.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It was like on the same day as Contributor Summit.
Yeah, we were at the Contributor Summit.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I remember what this is.
So, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Awesome. You said this isn't a API machinery feature. I'm wondering why you decided to implement it like this, then proposing hierarchical, I guess, native hierarchical namespaces to SIG API machinery.
So I have.
Okay. I'm just joking. Go on.
The bar for getting a crazy new radical change idea of namespace into API machinery is incredibly high. And without a very, very clear demand, all of those, I chatted about it with a couple of people at least internally at Google before I started on this project. And it seemed highly unlikely we would clear the bar without people screaming for it, which clearly they're not. Whereas a controller is something that we can implement very quickly, relatively, and it's optional. People can install it if they like, and it serves many of the same purposes, and it can be used as a way to prove out the idea. Now, let's say that we release this, and people go absolutely nuts for it, and they're like, what I really want now is a hierarchical list or hierarchical watch or some other kind of feature that can really only be done by API machinery. Well, then we have the customer demand, but I think the gap between where we are now and what it would take to get this into API machinery is just too high.
No, what awesome. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, I know a little about it beyond your description here, but I would wonder if this would ultimately be the easiest solution for trying to manage multiple namespaces. Like it feels a little bit odd, I suppose.
Are you thinking that you would rather have like a grouping like by labels versus like a grouping by like a graph-ish thing?
I should probably really go and read in detail. I will say I would have been one of those API machinery people that did say like, yeah, we're not likely to change the REST API to support hierarchical.
Who's speaking? I can't.
That's David Eads. So that's, yeah. He has both, right? He has SIG Auth and SIG API machinery.
Yeah.
So how would you?
Sorry, go ahead.
How would your approach differ, David? Or are you still formulating an opinion?
I'm still formulating an opinion. It does surprise me that we would try to do something like this instead of formulating primitives where someone with access to multiple projects or namespaces would be able to do the things like set up network policy between them. and then the aggregation aspect of it really seems questionable in light of the way that our controllers would operate when aggregating many of the primitive pieces.
I think there's like a constrained delegation aspect to this where right now we only have 2 nodes basically in our resource hierarchy, which is cluster level and namespace level. And for delegating subtrees, I think that this is what the proposal is meant to solve. That allows for more nested structures, like folders of namespaces.
And it does provide with some facilities for things like network policies across trees, because it puts well-defined and fully managed labels on subtrees of namespaces. So you could say things like anything from this tree of namespaces is allowed to access anything from that tree. In many ways, if you add that, the propagation and the self-service aspect, none of these things are rocket science. And maybe this is actually a good question that would lead us to be able to make a decision about this. I'm not aiming to convince everybody that this is the best or only possible way to represent tenancy, because it's clearly not. There's another project in the working group called the Tenant CRD that is, I think, closer to what you're describing. But it is a way that is tied very closely to existing Kubernetes primitives and a very sort of minimal extension. And so I guess what I'm asking is, what is the bar that is required to make this a sub-repo that is sponsored by SIG Auth? Is it, this is the recommended way to solve the kind of problem we're talking about, or this is a recommended way or a way that we're exploring? Because if it's the first one, then I think we need to do a lot more due diligence. If it's any of the second 2, which is what I thought we were aiming for, then with a lower bar, it might, some of these discussions, some of these topics, we could wait for user feedback to see.
We also have incubator projects as well. That I think it's reasonable to prove this stuff out. Working groups can't have their own repos, and the multi-tenancy working group is a subgroup of SIG Auth, so I think it makes sense for SIG Auth to at least get behind an incubator if this is something that the working group feels like they want to pursue.
So Tim, not Tim, sorry, Mike, are you thinking similar to the, was it the repo that I think Jim had made, just prefix or postfix with hash prototype or something to make sure that, big warning signs and not production code don't use?
We have a different org. We have a Kubernetes incubator.
The org itself.
So there's a Kubernetes incubator org, and there's a Kubernetes SIGs org, and we can graduate it once people are using it. But I would say if you just need to spot put stuff and play around and prove out an idea.
So it's funny, we have a spot. I have heard that the working groups are not supposed to have repos. Nevertheless, multi-tenancy does have one, and that's where we are right now. So we're in a multi-tenancy / incubator / HNC under Kubernetes SIGs right now. I'm not sure how that happened, but it did. I'm not super excited about moving it to a different temporary repo. So if the answer is that this is premature, maybe that is a good enough answer for now. I don't know. I mean, there is value in not having that history mingled with all of our other incubators. So I suppose there's that. Yeah, I didn't know that there was something called Kubernetes Incubator. How does one set up a repo there?
Yeah, so what is the current level of maturity of this project?
We are basically at the point where I would call it, we have a first draft of all of the features done. and we have a certain amount of productionization and stability. So for example, it has metrics, it has build process, it can be configured, and it's now at the point where I want to start getting feedback on it. So we've been working, it's been under development since August or so, with let's say 2.5 to 3 developers at Google working on it.
For the data secret driver, we were looking for adoption and multiple organizations before we moved it to its own SIG repo.
What about
that's probably what we want here.
Hello?
As a counterpoint, isn't the one for the policy working group prototype stuff in Kubernetes SIGs?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm missing. I don't know like what the difference really is between Kubernetes SIGs and Kubernetes Incubator when you can have like different levels of stability within Kubernetes SIGs.
I don't think anybody knows.
Maybe Jim, if you could send the issue that you had made for getting a repo created to Adrian, and we can have him copy that and replace things with the appropriate words, and let's start the discussion there.
Yeah, so if I could, and so that's actually kind of why we're here. I had originally went down that route, but in order to request a repo, you need sign off from the sponsor, which has to be a SIG. And according to SIG Auth's charter, the only way we can get a repo is if we are a sub-project. So that's us. I guess this is me trying to follow the stated processes. I'm happy to circumvent that just to get a repo created, but because that's all we really wanted to begin with. So yeah, I just want to know, I guess, from what's SIG Auth's, recommendation for this.
So I think the chair/tech leads need to like go read your KEP, and then we should respond to you on the KEP for what you should do next.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And I was just going to time box this because I know we need to get to the.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Having a recommendation for either something in Incubator or in SIGs sounds good to me. So thanks, everybody.
And also the final approval usually happens on the mailing list. So we do lazy consensus on the mailing list.
Sounds good. Thanks. And please send any other feedback that you have on GitHub, or my contact information, and Ryan's is all there. So thanks, everyone.
If I could just chime in with a few thoughts. We might need to revise our charter for kind of prototype or incubator style projects. I don't know that it makes sense for to require us being a sub-project before being in a prototype stage. And also, Adrian, to go back to your earlier question of like what the bar is for getting endorsed by SIG Auth, I don't think it should be that this is the one true way. I think it should be that this is a recommended approach, probably. And if it's more, this is an approach we're exploring, then it makes more sense for it to be in kind of the prototype / incubator stage. And before making a decision around, do we actually want to endorse this as a sub-project, I'd like to kind of think a little more about what that means for SIG Auth. Like, what are we committing to as a SIG if we take this on as a sub-project?
Okay. Yeah, I think the incubator, I think from what I've heard here, incubator sounds like the right thing we should be aiming for right now. And so, yeah, understanding what it would mean for you to endorse it at the incubator stage sounds good to me.
Tim, do you want to start the discussion on the future of dynamic audit?
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to talk about this because dynamic audit has been in alpha I don't actually know off the top of my head what release it was introduced in, but it's been in an alpha state for a while. We've had a few attempts to kind of progress it, either to beta or to build out a policy spec first. And neither of those have kind of made much progress. So I'm concerned about dynamic audit being sort of stuck in this alpha state where we know there's a lot of issues with it and not making much progress. So I guess what I would like to discuss here are, or maybe what I would like to see is either a plan for a concrete plan for how we're going to get this to beta, or think about removing it from core Kubernetes and building it out as a sort of a dynamic multiplexing audit proxy instead that could be developed as an independent project. And then if we went the latter route, I don't necessarily want to go too deep into that right now, but if we went the latter route, I would propose sort of building it out as actually a SIG endorsed subproject. And then if that project gains enough momentum and steam, then we could discuss what it would look like to kind of fold that back into core Kubernetes. So I know a bunch of people who have worked on or are interested in this project are here. So kind of like.
I wanted to go ahead and say I am watching the participants list for like raise hand. So I mean, no one is raising hand right now, so someone can talk if they want to talk. But if you want if you need to say something, I will help facilitate.
Do I need to raise a hand before I need to talk, or?
No, no one is talking right now, so go for it.
No, it was just an ask. Could you elaborate eventually if we went to that route to have it as a sub-project and develop something like an out of process, probably webhook that's going to do the mux, the requests and so on. How physically would that look? Do you mean to have something else that needs to be installed along the API server, or I'm just trying to imagine this?
Yeah, so I think with that approach, we would have a separate binary that would be running. It could run anywhere, but it would probably make sense to ship it as a container with pod spec. And so that could either run as a static pod on the master or a regular pod in the user cluster, and then get registered as a webhook. And so in that case, we wouldn't have dynamic webhooks, so it would have to be statically configured on the master to say, send audit events to this server, wherever it is. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yep, absolutely. That's what I was trying to clarify. And is there other examples like this? Is it like a normal practice?
I think the authenticating proxy is sort of a similar idea, kind of in the other direction.
And then back to probably gathering some information to make an informed decision at the end. What would be the pros and cons then to go in this direction? I mean, that would be sort of a playground to verify the concepts, or what?
Not a playground. I mean, that would be a fully functional feature, right? Like this is the way that we do it for something like authentication or authorization. You get one hook, but then that one hook can choose to do whatever it wanted.
It's just not in the API server.
One major benefit to this approach for me is that we don't have to figure out the productionalization performance of this, because it would be post-processing in the model that Tim proposed. That seems like a substantial challenge with the current model. And then more generally, if we can build things as extensions, we should try to build things as extensions first. Just that's the trend that Kubernetes has taken over the last couple of years.
Tim, if I understand correctly though, like the way this would be configured is you would configure the CLI based config to this catch-all sync, right? And then just configure that catch-all sync with a CRD or whatever?
I'm not sure I exactly understood what you're saying. So right now we have the ability to configure a static webhook for sync for audit, and so you would have to
Didn't freeze for everyone?
Yeah, sorry, I dropped there too.
Yeah, Tim, I think.
Okay. That's unfortunate.
So, I'll try to answer the question. Tim, are you back?
Oh, sorry. Am I cutting out?
Yeah, we lost you for a second.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, if you can still hear me. Yeah, so the static, I'm not sure where you lost me actually.
Start from the beginning of Mo's question.
Yeah, okay, so so we already have the ability to have a static webhook. And so in this case, you would set up the dynamic audit server would be that static webhook that you would have to manually configure through API server flags or config. And then once you have that dynamic server set up, that would have an associated CRD that would be used to configure the dynamic syncs. And then all of the logic for routing audit events to dynamic syncs would happen in the dynamic server. Does that answer the question?
One other question to that, then probably also the policy that is the static policy. You know what I mean? The static policy that's in place also has to go through the dynamic one, or there are chances that it's going to filter the event stream.
Yeah. So basically, what I'm proposing with this model is that we would make basically no changes to the way audit works today. So you would still have a static audit policy that would control which events go to the static webhook, which is actually the dynamic audit server. So if you have a policy that says secrets only get metadata, then your dynamic audit webhooks could never get more than metadata. You could still filter on top of the static policy, but you would never be able to get more than the static policy. If you want the dynamic webhooks to be able to receive everything, then you would need the static policy to basically say everything gets full request response level. One concern there is we would hit some performance issue. We know that there's some performance issues if you're auditing everything at full level. And I think that those performance issues we should address in core Kubernetes regardless.
So at least from VMware's concern, like I know the main thing we need is just to turn that on. Like we just dynamically turn it on. I feel like this API has been held up just solely on the policy piece. Like people want a lot of things of the policy, which makes sense, but that's kind of held up, you know, the ability to just configure a sync dynamically, right? Like I almost wonder if we could just separate out the sync from the policy and just say you're going to use the master audit policy that's there, but you could dynamically configure syncs. I wonder if that would be more agreeable. Certainly from our, it's just the hardest thing is like we take a lot of, you know, clusters back. We adopt clusters into a management platform, and we just want to turn the auditing on and get that audit data. And right now that would require restarting the API server. which is super unfortunate. And, you know, on the other level, like the cloud providers have a real monopoly over this data that, you know, it can only go to their tooling. There's no way to kind of get it out any other way. So I wonder if just dropping the policy entirely. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
For some things that traditionally were statically configured, like certificate authorities around different client and authentication proxy setups, that has recently been made dynamic. That used to require API server restarts, and has started to honor updates to those files. Would it make sense to do something similar with the static audit configuration? That would let someone who did want to drive that dynamically regenerate and update that to basically only include the union of the things that they needed to route to their backends.
So you mean like dynamically updating the config file? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd still be a lot harder, I guess, because then you need like access to the master node to get to that file. It's certainly harder than where the feature is today.
Yeah, I mean, the presumption is that if we went the route where we basically keep the API server the way it is today and route things to this statically configured webhook, the presumption is that the person configuring the API server is pointing it at a webhook that they know they are managing dynamically and is going to do this multiplexing. And so there's some level of cooperation assumed there. If you wanted to have a backend that was going to be dynamically configurable, honoring dynamic changes
Patrick
to.
is getting at, Jordan, is that coordination doesn't exist when you build a platform that runs arbitrary clusters. That you don't know like where the file is or if the file is accessible. So I think what he's asking for is leave the static policy alone. Just let me like append syncs to it effectively, dynamically.
That still assumes a level of cooperation between the person defining the static policy to begin with.
No, I understand, right? But what that means is that your dynamic sync can get the same events that the static sync does. So there's no like hierarchy of like better sync, right? So if a cloud provider configures the sync to have all events, the dynamic sync has all events. If they configure a secret as just metadata, well then the sync has metadata. Right?
I'm not sure I buy that results in a usable portable API. Like send me events, maybe some events. I don't know which ones. Like that. That doesn't seem like that seems like half a solution to me.
I mean, we would certainly take that over the other options. I mean, looking at it from the perspective of building out kind of a multi-cloud system, adopting in clusters and providing features like third-party features, even if it was, hey, you know, they set this policy that's somewhat restrictive, so we're not going to get all of everything, they would still have control over that. And that's a good kind of agreement, you know, for this like real world solution we're trying to fix.
So I think what's being pointed out here is that this has failed to progress because a coherent solution that can have consistent and expected results across any cluster using this API doesn't exist and hasn't been presented since this alpha thing was created. I think one thing to consider here is that we've already taken a stance on things need to be moving in beta and show progress on a regular cadence. Maybe what we're missing here is seeing that progress on the alpha.
I'm sorry. I think actually it's a little bit more to that because actually just before things stalled, we had a solution that, and the reason why it was stalled and we moved to another solution was mainly there was no agreement on whether it's too complex or not. It was not about how consistent it is, because it actually spanned all the use cases that have been figured out.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, Gregory, you had like a 30-page doc or something, just kind of trying to go through the, here's a persona and here's the thing.
That was a complementary, yes,
Right.
to the KEP.
Couple thoughts here. So one, cloud providers would still need to enable this feature. I guess if it's built into core, then it's kind of a more expected kind of standard thing. We could eventually call it something that's conformant. If we had the separate dynamic server, that doesn't mean that cloud providers can't still enable that. It would just be on them to go and configure it manually and probably host the dynamic server. Also, it's not just the policy pieces that have held this up in alpha. There's some performance issues and some productionization issues with the way it's currently architected. I think that if we said that we're going to apply the same static policy to dynamic and to the dynamic webhooks, then we might be able to simplify the architecture quite a bit and maybe fix some of those performance issues. But is that kind of the long-term right solution that we want there? I'm not sure.
It certainly would be an easy fix to those performance problems. It'd be a very easy fix. So, and like, yeah, you could, you know, try and get the cloud providers like put a separate server install. I just think it's gonna be a hard sell. I think it's pretty easy to get them to turn that flag on by default to say, you know, we need to do that to test conformance of clusters.
I think it's going to be harder than you think to turn this on for GCP or AWS. I can't speak for AWS, but
I mean, we have a lot of people kind of that think we could do this just based on saying if we write conformance tests that, you know, there's a lot of ideas in conformance about leveraging the feature to plug in conformance and see how the API server is acting.
I would be. So, yeah. I wouldn't expect this to be a conformance trait. I mean, I think you could definitely have a server that was conformant that was managed by someone else where they didn't want to let you do this.
Right, I guess you could, but it certainly would be nice from a conformance level to know exactly what's kind of happening. And there's been talk of that over kind of in the conformance world. So the idea, you know, would be we could more easily kind of leverage to get this turned on, and then we would have, you know, more third-party plugins that could access this data, which is really valuable, right? And it's difficult to get to today. So.
What concerns me is, Tim, you mentioned that actually the performance issues still need to be chased in the core. So even splitting out of it seems to not be a solution in this case, or at least it should not be the reason to.
I think sending every audit event to the dynamic hook would have performance implications. If we use the same static policies we're using today, then the performance should be unchanged because it's the API server itself is doing exactly what it's doing today.
Well, it unchanged, but times whatever number of syncs you have registered. Or you're saying just send it to the dynamic hook and let it multiplex if it wants to.
Yeah, and they could write their own policy on top of it.
Yeah. The combination of the combination of multiple making the API server write to multiple backends. Like, I think no matter what you do, that's going to have fairly significant performance impact. It's a lot better than writing different things to different backends, but that combined with the sort of unsatisfying half API of like register a sync, and you'll maybe get like what you get is undefined if the policy isn't associated with it. I don't see a great way for this to give us something that I think works well.
I mean, from our standpoint, like having that master policy is almost ideal because it gives the provisioner some level of control of what could ultimately come out of the cluster. So like in our relationships and discussions we've had with people trying to get this turned on, like that would actually probably be more ideal. So I don't see that as a detraction at all. Like I get that it's somewhat undefined, but it's being defined, you know, within that relationship.
So we're at time, unfortunately, but I think that this is a good conversation, and I want to kind of move this forward. My proposal for next steps here are, we've heard kind of a couple different proposals, and so I suggest that everyone who has some kind of idea of how to move forward with this, maybe try and write up like, not a KEP, but like a very rough, like kind of one-page proposal. And then maybe in the next meeting, we could sort of review those in a little more detail than we have here, and kind of carry the discussion that way. Does that make sense?
Sounds good.
Cool. Before we end, I was going to ask, does anyone have like performance numbers of like what happens to an API server that is actually doing work and you just send all events to some sync? Like just one sync, the sync. Like, does it work at all?
I don't have the numbers, but there is a there's an issue open about it that I think has some issue. I'm not sure if there's numbers in there, but I can link to it.
When we had quite a few things in the default policy, we started failing our scalability tests. This happened a couple of years ago. And then this was just for the static policy. So the default policy got tweaked to just have metadata for some things and omit some high volume things, clients, namespaces. Yeah, so I mean, we immediately failed scalability tests.
Okay. Yeah, I guess if we try to figure this out, it would be, like, I would be curious if you can actually run a large cluster in any environment just with all the events all the time. Cool. Well, thank you everyone for attending. See you in the next one. Cheers.